12 Days of Christmas Serial Killings. A Miss Marple mystery. Welcome to Mystery Crackers. I'm Michael, your host for tonight's Miss Marple mystery. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Before we begin, I'd love to know what's something you've always been curious about. A small habit people have, a place you've never been, or even a mystery that stayed with you for years. Share it with us in the comments. I truly enjoy reading your thoughts. Now then, settle in, and let's begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. The village of St. Mary's Hollow was a quaint, peaceful place, especially during the holiday season. Nestled between rolling hills and surrounded by frost-covered trees, it looked like a Christmas card brought to life. The houses, each unique in their way, stood shoulder to shoulder along cobblestone streets, their windows decorated with twinkling lights. The scent of wood smoke and mulled wine filled the air, and the sound of carolers singing was heard from every corner. On this particular afternoon, the village gathered in the old parish hall for their annual Christmas tea. It was the social event of the season, where the ladies of the village exchanged polite conversation, gossiping about the latest goings-on in St. Mary's Hollow. The men, ever so proper, sipped their brandy and kept their discussions centred on the weather and the local hunting season. The whole event, as it always did, buzzed with unspoken tension and hidden rivalries, carefully masked by festive cheer. Miss Marple, of course, was there, though she wasn't the type to dominate conversations or call attention to herself. She preferred to watch, listen, and take note of the tiny telling details that others overlooked. She was the observer, the quiet presence in the room, unnoticed by most, but always vigilant. With her silver hair neatly styled, a lavender scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, and her spectacles perched delicately on her nose, she blended seamlessly into the crowd, an unassuming figure. Yet, even here, in the midst of all this festive happiness, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The village, it seemed, was on edge. As the tea continued and guests chatted in groups, Miss Marple observed the subtle interactions between people. Mrs. Henshaw, for example, was talking to Mrs. Collingwood in a low voice, her eyes darting around the room. She was fidgeting with her necklace, twisting the delicate chain between her fingers. Miss Marple caught the briefest glimpse of unease in her expression, which quickly melted into the practiced smile she always wore at social gatherings. "Such a lovely gathering," Mrs. Henshaw had said, her voice a touch too high-pitched, betraying her nervousness. "Yes, indeed," Mrs. Collingwood replied, sipping her tea, "though I do hope the weather doesn't turn bitter. My poor Charles will be cross if his fishing plans are ruined again." But Miss Marple wasn't fooled by the surface-level pleasantries. There was something beneath the surface, a ripple of discomfort in the way people shifted their weight, the half-sentences left hanging in the air, the way certain names were mentioned and then quickly dropped. The tea party was nearing its end, and Miss Marple had just taken a delicate sip from her cup, when the door to the hall opened with a loud creak. The cold winter air swept in, and a figure stepped into the room, a tall man with sharp features and a grim expression. It was Inspector Thorne, recently assigned to St. Mary's Hollow, and the room fell into a brief, uneasy silence. He was a newcomer to the village, and though he had been polite enough, he had not yet earned the villagers' trust. Inspector, what brings you here today?" asked Mr. Collingwood, attempting to break the tension, though his voice held a slight quiver. Inspector Thorne glanced around, his gaze briefly landing on Miss Marple, who met his eyes with her usual calm demeanour. He didn't speak immediately, as if he were deciding how best to phrase his words. The room waited, a heavy silence pressing down on the gathering. "I'm afraid I have some rather grim news," Thorne said finally, his voice carrying across the room. "A body has been found in the woods just outside the village. It looks like foul play." The air seemed to freeze. The cheerful clinking of teacups stopped, and the laughter that had filled the hall a moment ago vanished. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Henshaw gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. "Who was it?" Mrs. Collingwood asked, her voice a touch too sharp. Thorne's gaze swept over the room once more, his eyes lingering for a moment on Miss Marple before answering. "I don't know the details yet, but the body was found not far from the old mill. I suspect we'll be dealing with more than just an accident." The room fell into a tense silence again, the festive atmosphere completely gone, replaced by the chilling realization that something was terribly amiss in St. Mary's Hollow. Miss Marple, however, simply took another sip of her tea, her thoughts already turning. A crime, a body, a hidden darkness in the village that no one had seen coming. As the others began to chatter nervously, Miss Marple's mind was already working, piecing together the smallest clues, observing the little details that most others missed. She would need to be subtle. She would need to listen carefully and wait for the right moment to speak. But something told her that this murder was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The next morning, St. Mary's Hollow was shrouded in a thick grey fog, the kind of fog that clung to the streets like a heavy blanket, turning the familiar into something eerie and unknown. Miss Marple stood at her window, gazing out at the silent village. Her mind replayed the events of the previous day. Inspector Thorne's grim announcement, the uneasy atmosphere at the YA tea gathering, the unspoken questions that seemed to hang in the air like the mist outside. Something was amiss, and she could feel it. After a light breakfast, Miss Marple made her way to the village square, where she had planned to speak with some of the locals. It wasn't yet the time for official investigations, but the villagers were bound to know more than they let on. They always did. It was just a matter of asking the right questions, and more importantly, listening to the answers they didn't mean to give. As she walked past the row of quaint cottages, she noticed how the village, usually so vibrant, seemed quieter than usual. The gossip mill had already begun to churn. Whispers followed her as she passed familiar faces, but they quickly hushed when she turned her head. The murder had left everyone on edge. It wasn't just the death itself. It was the realization that someone among them was capable of such a crime. The fear had begun to spread, and with it, the cracks in the village's carefully crafted facade were starting to show. Miss Marple stopped at Mrs. Collingwood's shop, the village's small general store, where the widow always had a moment for a chat. Mrs. Collingwood was behind the counter, sorting through a pile of receipts when Miss Marple entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Collingwood," Miss Marple said cheerfully, her voice warm but measured. "How are you today?" Mrs. Collingwood, a short, stout woman in her early 60s, looked up and forced a smile. Her hands trembled as she set the receipts down. "Oh, Miss Marple, good morning. I'm quite well, thank you, though I can't say the same for the village. Such a dreadful thing, isn't it?" "It is indeed," Miss Marple replied, her gaze softening. "Have you heard anything further about the poor soul found in the woods?" Mrs. Collingwood sighed, her face creasing with worry. "Not much, I'm afraid. The inspector was here earlier, asking questions, but nothing concrete yet. Everyone's saying it was a robbery gone wrong, but I don't know. It doesn't sit right with me." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her mind already turning. "What doesn't sit right, Mrs. Collingwood?" The widow glanced around the shop, as if checking that no one was listening. Then she leaned in, speaking in a low voice. "Well, it's just the body was found near the old mill, right? But no one can figure out why the poor man was there at all. He wasn't one for walking about in that part of the woods, especially not alone. And Miss Marple, did you know that he had been a friend of Mr. Henshaw's? Mrs. Henshaw's husband, I mean." Miss Marple's interest piqued at the mention of Mr. Henshaw's name. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone casual but her mind sharp. "What kind of friendship did they have?" Mrs. Collingwood hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "Well, from what I've heard, it wasn't exactly above board. I don't want to gossip, of course, but I've heard whispers of disagreements. Financial disagreements mostly. Mr. Henshaw's business has been struggling a bit lately, and I suspect that things might not have been as friendly as they seemed." "Interesting," Miss Marple mused aloud, her thoughts racing. The more she learned, the more it seemed that everyone in this village had something to hide. "Do you think the Henshaws know more than they're letting on?" Miss Marple asked carefully, her eyes meeting Mrs. Collingwood's. The widow's face flushed, and she quickly looked away, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of her apron. "I couldn't say, Miss Marple, but I wouldn't be too quick to trust anyone these days, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already formulating a list of questions for Mrs. Henshaw. But she wasn't in any rush. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but she had learned long ago that patience was key. The truth would come in time, but only if she allowed it to reveal itself naturally. "Thank you, Mrs. Collingwood," Miss Marple said with a smile. "I'm sure you've given me much to think about. I'll leave you to your work." As she stepped out of the shop and back into the foggy streets, Miss Marple reflected on what she had learned. A financial dispute between the victim and Mr. Henshaw, an argument that could have been about money or something deeper. Could it have been a motive for murder? It was certainly a possibility, but there was still much she didn't know. Before Miss Marple could delve deeper into her thoughts, the sound of hurried footsteps caught her attention. She turned to see a young woman, breathless and flustered, hurrying toward her. It was Mary, the Henshaws' housemaid. "Miss Marple!" Mary exclaimed, her voice a mix of fear and urgency. I have to talk to you. It's about Mr. Henshaw. There's something you need to know." Chapter 3. Miss Marple watched as Mary, the Henshaws' housemaid, hurried toward her with a look of urgency. The young woman was usually composed, but today her wide eyes and trembling hands spoke of something far more unsettling. Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was sharp, piecing together the scene that had unfolded in the village. "Mary, my dear, what is it?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice soothing, like a balm to the girl's obvious distress. Mary glanced around nervously, as though the fog itself might be listening. I shouldn't be telling you this, Miss Marple, but I don't know who else to turn to." She stopped in her tracks, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It's about Mr. Henshaw and the man who was found dead." Miss Marple nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. "Go on, dear. I promise you, nothing you tell me will go further unless you want it to." The girl hesitated, her eyes darting nervously down the street before returning to Miss Marple. "The night before Mr. Henshaw's body was found, I overheard something. I wasn't supposed to be in the study, but I was cleaning the windows, and the door was open." She swallowed hard, clearly battling with her own guilt. Mr. Henshaw was talking to someone. It was all in whispers, but I caught bits and pieces. Miss Marple waited, her expression patient but expectant. She had learned long ago that people often spilled their secrets in the heat of their own anxiety. Mary took a deep breath before continuing. He was arguing with someone. A man, I think. They were talking about money, something about a debt. Mr. Henshaw was upset, saying he didn't have enough to pay it off, and the man was demanding it. He said something like, "You'll pay one way or another, Henshaw." Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. A debt, a man, a demand, this was becoming clearer. The relationship between the dead man and Mr. Henshaw was more complex than she had originally assumed. "Did you hear anything else, Mary? Anything specific about who this man was or what Mr. Henshaw intended to do?" The girl shook her head, her face pale. "No, Miss Marple. I only heard those few words. But it sounded like Mr. Henshaw was frightened. He didn't want to talk about it any more. I saw him go to his study to work on some papers after that, but he was never the same after that conversation." Miss Marple considered this information carefully. It was a small clue, but it tied the victim to Mr. Henshaw in a way that suggested more than just a casual acquaintance. It was becoming apparent that Mr. Henshaw had more to lose than he had let on, and whoever this man was, whoever he had been, he was now at the centre of Miss Marple's growing puzzle. "Thank you for telling me this, Mary," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know this is difficult, but you've done the right thing." She placed a reassuring hand on the young woman's arm, sensing that there was more at play here than just a simple debt. The housemaid nodded, her eyes welling up with tears, though she blinked them away quickly. "I just thought you should know, Miss Marple. I'm so sorry for overhearing, but I couldn't keep it to myself any more. You've been very brave, Mary. Don't worry, this will stay between us for now." Miss Marple smiled gently before adding, "Now go home and rest. I may have more questions for you later." As Mary walked away, Miss Marple stood still for a moment, letting the details of the conversation swirl around in her mind. A debt, a frightened man, and an argument that had ended with the man's death. But there was something more, something subtle in the air that told Miss Marple there were deeper layers to uncover. Turning on her heel, she made her way toward the Henshaw residence. She knew she couldn't jump to conclusions yet, but the pieces were falling into place, slowly, methodically, just as they always did. Upon arrival at the Henshaw estate, Miss Marple was met at the door by Mrs. Henshaw, whose porcelain face seemed paler than usual. She wasn't surprised to see Miss Marple. She had already known that the village's most astute observer would be poking into matters before long. Still, there was a coolness in Mrs. Henshaw's voice as she ushered Miss Marple inside. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her words polite but strained. "I suppose you've come to ask about yesterday's dreadful news." "Indeed, Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm but professional. "I was hoping to speak with you about your husband's business dealings, if you wouldn't mind, of course." Mrs. Henshaw's expression tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. "I'm afraid there's not much to say. My husband wasn't a man who spoke of his finances with others." She forced a smile. "But I do appreciate your interest in the matter." Miss Marple nodded politely, though her mind was already sifting through the woman's carefully constructed words. "I understand, Mrs. Henshaw, but as I've learned from long experience, Sometimes the smallest details can provide the most telling clues. Mrs. Henshaw didn't respond immediately, but Miss Marple could see the tightness in her jaw, the subtle shift of her shoulders as she stood a little straighter. She was trying to hide something, Miss Marple could tell, and Miss Marple would find it, whether Mrs. Henshaw liked it or not. As they walked toward the drawing room, Miss Marple caught sight of the study door, half open, as if waiting for her. It seemed to beckon her closer, but she restrained herself for the moment. There was still much to learn, and she had no intention of rushing to conclusions. As she sat down, Mrs. Henshaw continued to talk, but Miss Marple was no longer listening to her words. She was watching for the subtle tells, the slight hesitations, the way Mrs. Henshaw's eyes darted toward the fireplace when she mentioned her husband's late-night work habits. Miss Marple smiled inwardly. It was a beginning. Chapter 4. The Henshaw house was quiet, too quiet. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her hands folded neatly in her lap as Mrs. Henshaw flitted about, offering tea with an air of forced hospitality. The faint clinking of porcelain was the only sound breaking the stillness. Despite the decorum, there was a sense of tension in the air, a tension that hung over the room like the fog outside, thick and impenetrable. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were elsewhere. Her eyes, though politely fixed on Mrs. Henshaw, were constantly darting to the study door. It remained ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light escape. She had noticed it when she entered, and it seemed to be calling to her. A door left half open, an invitation too subtle to ignore. "Do you mind if I take a look at your husband's study?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but insistent, as though it were the most natural thing to ask. Mrs. Henshaw froze for a moment, her hand hovering over the teapot. "My husband's study," she echoed, her voice slightly strained. "I suppose it's not in order, Miss Marple. It's been a rather distressing time, you understand." "Of course, Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple replied, her tone as gentle as ever. "But sometimes it's the disarray that reveals the most." Mrs. Henshaw's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't protest further. She simply nodded, her eyes narrowing as she led Miss Marple to the study. The door creaked open slightly more as they stepped inside, and Miss Marple took in the room with practised ease. The study was large and well appointed, its rich mahogany furniture and walls lined with books, giving it an air of importance. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, there were signs of recent disturbance. Papers were scattered on the desk in a disorganized heap, and the usual neatness of the room was disrupted by a half-open drawer and a chair pushed slightly out of place. "Your husband wasn't one for clutter, was he?" Miss Marple asked as she moved closer to the desk, her fingers brushing over the papers. "He seemed like a man of precision." Mrs. Henshaw, who had been hovering at the door, stiffened at the comment. "He was, but, well, the business troubles. Things have been a little chaotic recently." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the desk. "Business troubles, yes. And yet," she said slowly, "it seems that some things are left behind in haste." She reached for a half-finished letter, its ink slightly smudged, as though it had been hastily set aside. "This letter. It's addressed to someone named G. Pierce. Do you know who this is, Mrs. Henshaw?" The widow's face turned a shade paler. I don't know," she stammered, her eyes darting away. "Perhaps a creditor, or one of his business associates." Miss Marple studied her carefully. The hesitation in Mrs. Henshaw's voice was unmistakable, but she didn't press. Instead, she set the letter down, turning her attention to the open drawer. She pulled it out slightly further and was met with a stack of ledgers and papers, each one carefully arranged except for one. A single sheet of paper, partially torn at the edge, was shoved hastily to the bottom of the pile. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over it for a moment before she took it in hand. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a set of numbers. A list. A series of payments and debts, many of which had been crossed out hastily, as though they were meant to be forgotten. "What is this, Mrs. Henshaw?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. "It seems your husband had more debts than you mentioned." Mrs. Henshaw's face twisted in discomfort. You needn't explain, Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple said softly, her voice reassuring. "But it would be wise not to leave things hidden for too long. Secrets, after all, have a way of revealing themselves." Mrs. Henshaw remained silent, her eyes focused on the floor. Miss Marple glanced at the torn paper again. The list of debts was troubling, but it wasn't the financial burden that interested her. It was the last name on the list, G. Pierce. It had appeared in the letter as well. As Miss Marple turned back to Mrs. Henshaw, the silence in the room seemed to grow heavier, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw the widow's mask of composure slip, revealing something darker beneath. Her lips were pressed together tightly, and her hands, though still, clenched at her sides. "Who is G. Pierce?" Miss Marple asked once more, her gaze fixed intently on Mrs. Henshaw. The woman's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might faint. But then, with a quick shake of her head, Mrs. Henshaw straightened up, her posture stiff with defiance. "I've told you all I can, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Now, if you don't mind, I would like to be left alone. This is too much for me." Miss Marple did not press further. She simply nodded and stepped back, casting one last glance at the desk and the scattered papers. She had what she needed for now. As she left the study, Mrs. Henshaw did not follow her. The door to the study closed softly behind her, and Miss Marple took a moment in the hallway to collect her thoughts. There were more questions now than answers, but one thing was certain. Mrs. Henshaw was hiding something, and G. Pierce was at the centre of it all. Miss Marple walked slowly down the hallway, her mind already turning over the possibilities. She had to learn more about this G. Pierce, and soon. But first, there was still the matter of the dead man in the woods. The web was growing, and every thread seemed to lead back to a single, tangled knot. And Miss Marple had no intention of letting it stay knotted for long. Chapter 5. The day had hardly begun when Miss Marple found herself at the village post office, a small stone building with ivy creeping up the walls. It was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened, save for the exchange of letters, small packages, and the occasional heated debate over which brand of jam should be stocked on the shelves. But today, it held more than the usual morning bustle. Today, Miss Marple had come for something far more important than a letter. She entered the office with her usual quiet grace, the bell above the door jingling softly as she stepped inside. Behind the counter, Mr. Turner, the postmaster, was arranging a stack of letters. His spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his face lighting up with a brief smile. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you this morning. What brings you to the post office today?" he asked, his voice friendly but cautious. He had known Miss Marple all her life, but lately her presence in the village seemed more pronounced, almost like a shadow following the death of the man in the woods. "I was hoping you could help me with something," "Mr. Turner," Miss Marple said, her tone as light as ever. "I'm looking for a letter, a rather specific one. It was addressed to Mrs. Henshaw, and I believe it arrived just a few days ago." Mr. Turner's brow furrowed as he rummaged through a few papers behind the counter. "A letter for Mrs. Henshaw, you say? I'm afraid I can't recall anything like that coming through recently." Miss Marple gave a soft smile. "I understand, Mr. Turner, but I was wondering if perhaps you might have any other letters that were marked with special instructions for delivery. Something urgent, perhaps." Mr. Turner paused, glancing at the stack of letters in front of him. "Well, there was a letter a few days ago, now that you mention it. It wasn't for Mrs. Henshaw exactly, but it had her name on it. A special request, you might say. It was marked to be delivered directly to her, not left in the usual post. But, I'll admit, I didn't think much of it at the time. You know how these things go, Miss Marple. A lot of letters with odd instructions come through. You could say we get our fair share of drama in this sleepy little village." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with interest. "Do you still have it? The letter?" Mr. Turner hesitated, scratching his chin as he thought. "Now that you mention it, I do recall seeing it in the back. It came in a peculiar envelope, black with a wax seal. Rather formal, if you ask me. I'll fetch it for you." As Mr. Turner disappeared into the back room, Miss Marple's mind raced. A black envelope with a wax seal? That was no ordinary correspondence, and if it had been addressed to Mrs. Henshaw in such a peculiar manner, it likely contained information that the widow didn't want anyone to see. Moments later, Mr. Turner returned, holding the letter carefully between his fingers. He handed it over to Miss Marple with a puzzled look. "Here you go, Miss Marple, but I still don't understand. What's so important about this letter?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned the letter over in her hands. The wax seal was intact, bearing the imprint of a symbol Miss Marple didn't recognize, a crescent moon and a star, delicately embossed into the seal. She turned the letter to examine the address. It was indeed for Mrs. Henshaw, but the sender's name was scrawled in an unfamiliar hand, G. Pierce. "Thank you, Mr. Turner," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as ever. "This is exactly what I was looking for." Mr. Turner, still confused, nodded, but Miss Marple didn't wait for further questions. She tucked the letter into her bag and turned to leave the post office, her thoughts already racing. As she stepped out into the brisk morning air, Miss Marple's mind pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. G. Pierce was undoubtedly the man who had been at the centre of Mr. Henshaw's argument the night before the murder. The letter had been marked for delivery to Mrs. Henshaw, directly bypassing the normal mail system. But what did it contain? And why had Mrs. Henshaw gone to such lengths to hide it? Miss Marple had a hunch, but she wasn't ready to confront the widow just yet. There was more to uncover. She needed to see the letter for herself, to decipher its contents, but more importantly, she needed to understand who G. Pierce was, and what role he played in the darkened web of the Henshaw family's affairs. Chapter 6. The sun had begun its descent by the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She had spent the afternoon walking the village, letting the clues and fragments of information she had gathered stew in her mind. The letter from G. Pierce had sparked more questions than answers, but the wax seal and the name had lodged themselves in her thoughts, persistent as a pebble in a shoe. She sat down at her writing desk, carefully pulling the letter from her bag. The black envelope had an air of foreboding about it, though it contained no immediate danger. She delicately broke the seal, making sure to keep the fragments intact. The letter inside was written in the same elegant hand as the address on the envelope, its tone formal and businesslike. It was addressed to Mrs. Henshaw, but its contents were not as expected. The letter, dated a few days prior, stated, "Dear Mrs. Henshaw, I trust this letter finds you in good health. I regret to inform you that the matter we discussed previously remains unresolved. While I understand the pressure you may be under, I must insist that the matter be brought to a conclusion sooner rather than later. Your husband's reluctance to settle this debt has placed both of us in a precarious position, and as you know, I am not one to wait indefinitely. The terms remain the same as discussed. I am certain you will agree that this must be handled swiftly, for both our sakes. Yours sincerely, G. Pierce." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the final lines of the letter. A debt and a pressing demand to settle it. It was no small matter, and it seemed that Mrs. Henshaw had far more to lose than just her social standing. What was this debt? And why had Mr. Henshaw been so eager to hide it? She had no doubt that this was the same man involved in the argument overheard by Mary, the housemaid. G. Pierce was more than just a creditor. He was someone who held power over the Henshaws, someone with influence that extended beyond money. But why then had Mrs. Henshaw been so hesitant to share this information? What was she afraid of? Miss Marple sat back in her chair, contemplating the weight of the letter. It spoke of pressure, of an agreement that needed to be honoured, yet it also hinted at something darker. What exactly did Mr. Henshaw owe, and how far was he willing to go to protect the family's secrets? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple turned in her chair to see the figure of Inspector Thorne standing in the doorway, his brow furrowed and his expression unreadable. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, motioning for him to take a seat. "What brings you here this evening?" Thorne hesitated before speaking. "I've been going over the case, as you can imagine, and there's something I've been meaning to ask you." He paused again, as though unsure how to proceed. Miss Marple studied him carefully, her sharp eyes noting the subtle shift in his demeanour. "Go ahead, Inspector. I'm all ears. I'm starting to think there's more to this than just a simple murder," Thorne said, sitting down across from her. "You've been so quiet, Miss Marple, almost as though you already know something the rest of us don't." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "I assure you, Inspector, I'm simply observing. In a village like ours, it's often the smallest detail that reveals the greatest truths." Thorne leaned forward, his tone shifting from formal to something more personal. "I've seen that look in your eyes before, Miss Marple. You know something, don't you? About Mrs. Henshaw, about the victim, even about this G. Pierce. You've been digging, and I think you know more than you're letting on." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch between them, letting the weight of her observations hang in the air. "Inspector, you're a man of logic and reason," she said at last. "But sometimes it's not the facts that are most important, it's the people. The way they react, the things they don't say, the tiny shifts in behaviour that others might overlook. That's where the truth lies." Thorne regarded her carefully, his expression one of cautious interest. "So, what do you think? Who's responsible for the murder? And why?" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, as though she were already seeing the pieces fall into place. "It's not always about who did it, Inspector," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's about who stands to gain the most from it." Thorne frowned, but before he could ask more questions, Miss Marple continued. "I believe that Mrs. Henshaw's involvement in all of this is more than just incidental. The debt her husband owed, whatever it was far from simple. But she's hiding something, Inspector. Something important. And G. Pierce, I believe he knows more than anyone realizes." The inspector nodded slowly, as though considering her words. "I'll have to take a closer look at Pierce. But if you're right, Miss Marple, this could be much bigger than a simple murder." Miss Marple smiled softly, her eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. "Indeed, Inspector. But sometimes the simplest solutions can yield the most surprising results." As Thorne stood to leave, Miss Marple's mind raced ahead, already envisioning the next step in the investigation. She had a hunch that she was closing in on something important, but the full picture had yet to reveal itself. For now, she would wait, and when the time was right, the truth would come to light. Chapter 7. The fog had thickened by the time Miss Marple left her cottage the next morning, a damp mist that clung to her shawl as she walked. It was the kind of day that made everything feel a little more secretive, a little more veiled. It wasn't just the weather, it was the mood in the village, the murmur of suspicion, the quiet whispers that carried between the narrow lanes. Something in the air felt wrong. The murder of the night before hadn't been solved, and the web of lies and secrets was only growing more tangled with every passing hour. Miss Marple had spent the previous evening thinking about the letter she'd discovered at the post office, the one with the wax seal and the ominous demands from G. Pierce. The details had been unsettling, especially the mention of a debt that needed to be settled sooner rather than later. She had a sinking feeling that the situation was far more intricate than she had initially realized. Mrs. Henshaw, it seemed, was caught in the middle of something much darker than just a financial dispute. As Miss Marple walked toward the village centre, she spotted someone she hadn't expected to see. Standing by the flower shop, just a stone's throw from the post office, was Mary, the Henshaw's housemaid. She looked out of place in the bright sunlight, her face pale and drawn. Miss Marple slowed her steps. Her curiosity piqued. "Mary, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, approaching the young woman. "You're up early this morning. Is everything well?" Mary glanced up in surprise, then quickly lowered her gaze. She had been startled, but when she saw Miss Marple, her shoulders seemed to relax, as if the old woman's presence provided a sense of calm in the midst of her turmoil. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mary said softly, her voice tight with concern. "I didn't expect to see you here today. I was just thinking about last night, I mean." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She let Mary gather her thoughts, her expression one of patient understanding. After a pause, Mary spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I didn't tell you before. Something important. It's about Mr. Henshaw and the man he argued with." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though she kept her demeanour relaxed. "Go on, Mary. You can tell me." The young woman's hands twisted together nervously as she spoke. "The man Mr. Henshaw was arguing with, G. Pierce, I think he's called. He wasn't just any creditor. Mr. Henshaw owed him money, yes, but it was more than that. There was something personal between them, a deep sort of bitterness. I overheard them talking once, just before the argument. Mr. Henshaw was scared. He was pleading with G. Pierce not to do something, but I couldn't make out all the words." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Scared, you say? That's very telling, Mary. But do you know what they were fighting about? Was it just money or something else?" Mary hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "It was more than money, Miss Marple. Mr. Henshaw kept saying he would pay. He promised. But G. Pierce, he didn't want the money any more. He wanted something else. Something that I didn't understand. It was like Mr. Henshaw had gotten himself into something far deeper than he could handle." A cold shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine as she processed Mary's words. This wasn't just a matter of unpaid debts. It was something more insidious, a web of coercion and hidden dealings. If G. Pierce had something over Mr. Henshaw, it wasn't simply financial, it was personal, perhaps even criminal. And now it seemed that G. Pierce was using that leverage to manipulate those around him. "Thank you, Mary," Miss Marple said gently. "You've been very brave to tell me this. I'm sure it wasn't easy." Mary nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't want anyone to get hurt, Miss Marple. But I think Mr. Henshaw, he might have been more involved in something dangerous than anyone realizes. He wasn't just a businessman." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but there was a hard edge behind it now. "Don't worry, Mary. I'll take care of it. But you must promise me you'll be careful. You don't know what kind of people we're dealing with." "I will, Miss Marple," Mary replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll be careful, but I don't want anything bad to happen to anyone." Miss Marple watched the young woman for a moment longer, before giving a nod of reassurance. "Go home now. I'll do what I can to get to the bottom of this." As Mary disappeared down the street, Miss Marple stood for a moment, lost in thought. The pieces were falling into place, but they didn't fit together neatly. A debt, a threat, a man who had been forced into a dangerous situation. And now someone was dead. Miss Marple's steps were steady as she made her way back toward the Henshaw estate. There were still too many unanswered questions. Who was G. Pierce, really? What was his hold over Mr. Henshaw? And how far did this all go? She had no illusions. The danger was real. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the truth had a way of emerging, no matter how well it was hidden. All she needed was patience, a keen eye, and the determination to follow the threads wherever they led. And in the case of Mrs. Henshaw, G. Pierce, and the murder in the woods, the threads were leading her closer to a truth far darker than she had expected. Chapter 8. The afternoon sun had begun to dip beneath the horizon when Miss Marple arrived at the Henshaws' estate once again. The events of the past few days had led her here, back to the scene where so many of the answers and many of the questions seemed to originate. Mrs. Henshaw's evasions, the cryptic letter from G. Pierce, and now Mary's troubling revelations had all pointed to one undeniable fact. The web was far deeper and more tangled than Miss Marple had first imagined. The estate loomed ahead, quiet and dignified, its stone walls softened by the creeping ivy that had covered them for years. But beneath its serene exterior, Miss Marple knew there were secrets, and those secrets had cost a man his life. As she approached the door, Miss Marple's mind turned over the last clue she had gathered. Mary had spoken of a debt between Mr. Henshaw and G. Pierce. But it wasn't just any debt. It was the kind that threatened much more than financial ruin. The personal animosity between the two men was clear. There was something darker at play here, something neither Mrs. Henshaw nor Mr. Henshaw had been willing to address openly. But Miss Marple had no intention of letting it lie. She knocked twice, the sound echoing through the still air. Mrs. Henshaw opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been expecting her. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, her voice warm but with a slight edge. "I thought you might be back soon. Please, come in." Miss Marple smiled politely but kept her gaze sharp. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Mrs. Henshaw. I've simply come to ask a few more questions, if you don't mind." "Of course," Mrs. Henshaw replied, stepping aside to let Miss Marple pass. "I'm sure you're only trying to help. It's just that I can't seem to find any answers myself, not with all this uncertainty hanging over us." The two women moved to the sitting room, and Miss Marple took a seat by the fire. Mrs. Henshaw, after a brief moment of hesitation, seated herself opposite. "You said there were things you hadn't told me yet," Miss Marple said gently, her voice quiet but insistent. "Something about Mr. Henshaw's dealings, something you were keeping from me. What exactly were you afraid to share?" Mrs. Henshaw stiffened at the mention of her husband's affairs, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremble in her hands. "I didn't want to burden you with our troubles, Miss Marple," she replied, her voice faltering. "But you're right. There's something more. It's just difficult to talk about." Miss Marple remained silent, watching the widow as she searched for the right words. The tension in the room grew, thick and palpable. Finally, Mrs. Henshaw sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I've already told you about the debts, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "but I didn't tell you everything. Mr. Henshaw's debts were far greater than just the money we owed. He had made promises to G. Pierce, promises that he had no right to make. And those promises, well, they came with consequences." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but her face remained calm, giving nothing away. "What kind of promises, Mrs. Henshaw?" Mrs. Henshaw looked away, as though unwilling to meet Miss Marple's gaze. G. Pierce was more than just a creditor, she confessed. He was a business partner in some of Mr. Henshaw's less legitimate ventures. Things that weren't exactly above board. I didn't know about it at first, but I found out soon enough. And when I did, when I realized how deep we were in, I begged my husband to get out, but it was too late. Pierce wasn't just after money. He wanted power, control, and once my husband had given him that, there was no turning back. Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced together the widow's words. G. Pierce had been more than just a man collecting a debt. He had been manipulating Mr. Henshaw, using him for something far darker than mere finances. Power, control. The implications of those words were enormous. "And the argument you mentioned earlier," Miss Marple pressed gently, "was that when Mr. Henshaw finally realized what he had gotten himself into." Mrs. Henshaw nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "Yes, he was terrified, Miss Marple. He had no idea how deep it went. He tried to make amends, to settle everything, but G. Pierce wasn't interested in repayment. He wanted leverage, and he had it, over my husband, over me, over everything." Miss Marple sat back, her mind churning with the new information. The more she learned, the more she realized that G. Pierce was a man who thrived on control, using his knowledge of Mr. Henshaw's weaknesses to force him into a dangerous game. The debt, it seemed, had only been a small part of the larger web Pierce had spun. And now Mr. Henshaw was dead, with all the tangled strings of this affair hanging loose in the wind. "And the murder," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "You think G. Pierce was involved?" Mrs. Henshaw's eyes widened, and she looked away. "I don't know," she stammered, "but I fear that if we don't find him soon, things will only get worse." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I agree, but I believe we're getting closer to the truth, Mrs. Henshaw. The more we understand about this man, the clearer things will become." As Miss Marple stood to leave, she cast one final glance at the widow, her mind still spinning with the revelations of the past hour. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still one crucial part of the puzzle missing. Where was G. Pierce now? Chapter 9. The days that followed were shrouded in a quiet tension. Miss Marple had been turning over the details in her mind, connecting the pieces with methodical care. The revelation about G. Pierce, the manipulative partner in Mr. Henshaw's shady dealings, had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. It was one thing to suspect that a murder had been orchestrated for financial gain. It was another entirely to learn that the person behind it had far more power than Miss Marple had initially imagined. The village, however, had begun to move on. The murder had become an unspoken weight in the air, hovering just beneath the surface of daily life. Miss Marple walked through the streets, watching the people around her with a quiet intensity. They might pretend that nothing had changed, that the murder was just another tragic accident in a village that had always prided itself on its tranquility. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew that the pieces were coming together, and the person who had been pulling the strings was still very much a threat. It was late in the afternoon when she found herself in front of the inn, a modest but well-kept building on the edge of the village. The innkeeper, a jovial man named Mr. Baldwin, was usually a fountain of information, and Miss Marple had been meaning to speak with him for some time. She had learned that G. Pierce had been in the village not long before the murder, and that the inn was one of the few places where outsiders tended to stay. If anyone had seen him, it would be Mr. Baldwin. The inn was quiet when Miss Marple entered, the smell of fresh bread and brewing tea filling the air. Mr. Baldwin looked up from behind the counter, his face lighting up when he saw the familiar figure of Miss Marple. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly. "What brings you to my humble establishment today?" "Good afternoon, Mr. Baldwin," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "I was hoping you might help me with something. It's about a guest of yours, someone named G. Pierce." Mr. Baldwin's smile faltered for just a moment, though he quickly masked it with his usual friendliness. "G. Pierce, you say? I'm afraid I don't recall the name off the top of my head. You must understand we have many guests who come and go, and I don't always remember them all." Miss Marple studied him closely, noting the subtle shift in his expression. "Perhaps you could check your records for me. I understand that he was in town recently, and I was hoping to gather a bit more information about him." Mr. Baldwin hesitated again, a faint flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "Well, I suppose I could. But I must warn you, Miss Marple, that it's been quite some time since I've had anyone stay under that name. If you're looking for something more specific, I'm afraid I might not be much help." "Anything would be useful," Miss Marple replied gently, her voice unwavering. With a sigh, Mr. Baldwin led her to a small desk at the far end of the room, where a ledger sat open. He flipped through the pages slowly, his fingers brushing over the names until he stopped at one, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "Ah, here it is. G. Pierce," he muttered under his breath, then read aloud. "Stayed for 2 nights, just over a week ago. Paid in cash. Rather quiet fellow. Didn't say much. kept to himself mostly, left without much fanfare. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Did he have any companions during his stay? Anyone with him? Mr. Baldwin paused again, his brow furrowing. No, just him. There was no mention of anyone else. Wasn't the type to draw attention. I didn't ask questions, you know how it is. Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed the information. G. Pierce had come to the village, stayed quietly at the inn, and left without drawing attention. It seemed typical of someone trying to keep a low profile, but there was more to this story than met the eye. The fact that he had paid in cash was troubling. Who didn't leave a trace in such a small village, where gossip spread as quickly as the breeze? Did he have any dealings with the local businesses? Anyone who might have seen him or spoken to him? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Baldwin shook his head. Not that I know of. He kept to himself. Didn't even come down for breakfast most days. But now that you mention it, there was one thing. On the second day, he did speak with a man at the bar. A man I didn't recognize. But they were only talking for a few minutes before they both left. A man? Miss Marple repeated, her voice steady. Do you remember anything about him? Mr. Baldwin thought for a moment, then nodded. Tall, dark-haired, had the look of someone who didn't belong in a village like ours. Well-dressed, a bit too polished for my taste, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Do you know where they went after they left the inn? No, Miss Marple, I don't, Mr. Baldwin replied, looking a little uncomfortable. I'm afraid I can't be much help. I didn't notice anything else. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already at work. She thanked Mr. Baldwin for his time and stepped back into the cool evening air. The information was sparse, but it was enough to confirm one thing. G. Pierce was a man who operated in the shadows, keeping his dealings private and using his time in the village to remain undetected. She still didn't know the full extent of his influence, but one thing was clear. He was not a man to be underestimated. And the fact that he had been in the village just before the murder only deepened the mystery. As Miss Marple made her way down the quiet streets, the weight of the case pressed down on her. G. Pierce was still out there, somewhere, and Miss Marple was determined to find him, no matter where his trail led. Chapter 10. The days had slipped by quickly since Miss Marple's conversation with Mr. Baldwin at the inn, and the village seemed to have returned to its peaceful, though still somewhat uneasy rhythm. But Miss Marple knew better. She had long since realized that the quiet of St. Mary's Hollow was merely the calm before a storm that was beginning to gather around the shadowy figure of G. Pierce. With each passing hour, the pieces of the puzzle grew sharper, more defined, but there were still gaps, critical gaps that Miss Marple was determined to fill. That evening, as she sat in her cozy sitting room with a cup of tea, her thoughts began to turn toward the final aspect of the puzzle. G. Pierce himself. The more she had learned, the more she had come to understand that he was not merely a man with a collection of debts owed to him, but a man who had controlled situations from behind the scenes. A man who wasn't afraid to use leverage, secrets, and manipulation to get what he wanted. It was time to make the next move. The sound of a knock on her door broke through the quiet. Miss Marple set her cup down, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't surprised to see Inspector Thorne standing on her doorstep when she opened it. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Thorne greeted, though his tone was far from cheerful. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "I was just thinking about the case. Please come in." Thorne stepped inside, his brow furrowed as he looked around the small, humble room. "I've been following up on some of your leads," he said, his eyes narrowing as he met her gaze. "And there's something you need to know. I've managed to track down a few things about G. Pierce." Miss Marple gestured for him to continue, though her mind was already racing. She had known the inspector would make progress on his own. After all, it was his job. But she had been hoping for more details, and it seemed that now she would finally get them. "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged, her voice calm but expectant. Thorne looked down at the floor briefly before meeting her eyes again. G. Pierce isn't just some local businessman, as I initially thought. He's been moving around the country, trying to stay out of the spotlight. But I found something interesting. Pierce had dealings with several prominent families in London, investments, loans, things like that. But there's one name that keeps cropping up, Eleanor Fairclough. She's a well-known philanthropist in London, but her family's wealth was, shall we say, built on questionable foundations. Miss Marple felt a small thrill of recognition. Eleanor Fairclough. Miss Marple had heard that name before. A name tied to one of the oldest families in London, rich with connections but murky when it came to the details of their fortune. The connection to G. Pierce wasn't something Miss Marple had expected, but it made sense. If Pierce had access to powerful families, it would explain how he had been able to manipulate Mr. Henshaw into deeper debt, and perhaps even how he had managed to escape suspicion for so long. "I knew there had to be more to Pierce than met the eye," Miss Marple said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Eleanor Fairclough, what is her connection to all of this?" Thorne paused, then spoke slowly, as if he were testing his own theory. "I believe she was one of his main backers, Miss Marple. She and her family had a great deal of money tied up in Pierce's ventures, and when things started to go south, I suspect Pierce's leverage extended beyond just Mr. Henshaw. He might have been controlling more than one person at once, pressuring Mr. Henshaw, while keeping Eleanor Fairclough's family in line. The question is, why?" Miss Marple's mind spun as she processed the information. The web was getting wider, not narrower. And yet, despite all of this, the murder still seemed to come back to one thing: control. Could it be that Mr. Henshaw was just a pawn in a much larger game? Miss Marple mused aloud. A piece in a financial strategy that involved more than just money. If Pierce was pressuring other people, maybe his murder wasn't just about the money owed to him. Thorne nodded, clearly following her reasoning. "That's what I'm starting to think, but there's something more. Something that has been bothering me. Pierce has been moving around for years, but we've never been able to catch up with him. We know his associates, we know his dealings, but we don't know where he is now. It's as though he's always one step ahead." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. "One step ahead. Yes, I think I know where he is." Thorne looked at her in surprise. "Where?" "Not where, Inspector, but who," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but certain. "Eleanor Fairclough. She's the key to finding Pierce. She's been protecting him, or at least enabling him. If anyone knows where he's hiding, it's her." Thorne's eyes widened. "You're suggesting we speak to her?" Miss Marple nodded. "We don't have much choice, but we must be careful. People like Eleanor Fairclough don't give up their secrets easily, and Pierce may have more influence over her than we realize." Thorne stood up, the weight of the decision settling over him. "All right, Miss Marple. I'll take the lead on this, but I need your help. I can't do it alone." Miss Marple smiled faintly, a glimmer of something deeper in her eyes. "I wouldn't dream of leaving you to handle it by yourself, Inspector. Let's go to London. It's time to meet Eleanor Fairclough." Chapter 11. The train ride to London was uneventful, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks filling the silence between Miss Marple and Inspector Thorne. The city loomed ahead, a sprawling mass of stone and glass, its pace quick and relentless. It was a world away from the quiet village of St. Mary's Hollow. But Miss Marple knew it was here, in this metropolis of secrets and hidden dealings, that the final piece of the puzzle would be found. The journey had been long, but Miss Marple's mind had stayed focused. G. Pierce, Eleanor Fairclough, these names had been constant in her thoughts since the revelation at the inn. Miss Marple had a suspicion that the Fairclough family's wealth wasn't as innocent as it appeared, and if she was right, Eleanor was involved in a much larger game of manipulation than anyone had yet realized. As the train screeched to a halt at London's main station, the two of them disembarked. Thorne looked at Miss Marple with a furrowed brow. "Are you sure about this, Miss Marple? We don't know how she'll react. Eleanor Fairclough is a powerful woman. Her family name carries weight." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with a quiet confidence. "I'm certain, Inspector. She's the key, and I have a feeling she knows far more than she's letting on." They took a cab to Fairclough Manor, an imposing building situated on the outskirts of the city, its stone walls and ivy-covered facade suggesting a long history of wealth and influence. As the carriage rolled through the gates, Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder about the secrets that lay hidden within its walls. The driver came to a halt in front of the grand entrance, and Miss Marple and Inspector Thorne stepped out, both of them adjusting their coats against the cold wind. The air felt charged, as though something was about to happen. A confrontation, perhaps, or a revelation. A footman greeted them at the door, his expression polite but wary. "Good afternoon. How may I assist you?" "I'm here to speak with Miss Eleanor Fairclough," Miss Marple said, her voice steady and calm. "It's a matter of some importance." The footman hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I will inform her immediately. Please wait here." The grand entrance hall was quiet, its marble floors and high ceilings giving it an air of sombre grandeur. As they waited, Miss Marple studied the room, her gaze sharp, taking in every detail. She noticed a large portrait of a man hanging on the far wall, perhaps Eleanor Fairclough's father or grandfather. The stern expression on his face suggested a legacy of power and control. Before she could dwell further on the portrait, the door to the drawing-room opened and a tall woman entered, Eleanor Fairclough. She was dressed impeccably, her dark hair swept back into an elegant updo. There was a coldness in her demeanour, but also a kind of grace, a quiet authority that Miss Marple knew all too well. "Miss Marple," Eleanor Fairclough said, her voice smooth but laced with a faint edge of surprise. "I didn't expect a visit from someone of your reputation. What brings you to my home?" Miss Marple smiled politely, but there was an underlying sharpness to her gaze. "I'm afraid it's not a social call, Miss Fairclough. I've come to discuss something far more serious, something that I believe involves you directly." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but she did not react openly. Instead, she motioned for them to sit. "I see. Well, you've piqued my curiosity. Please tell me what this is about." As Miss Marple and Inspector Thorne took their seats, Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on Eleanor. "It's about G. Pierce. I believe you and he have had dealings. Very troubling dealings, in fact." Eleanor's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "G. Pierce she repeated, her tone calculated. "I don't know what you think you know, but I can assure you, Miss Marple, I have no idea what you're referring to. G. Pierce is a businessman with whom I've had some minor dealings, nothing more." Miss Marple did not flinch. "A businessman, yes, but I believe it was far more than that, Miss Fairclough. I believe that your connection to him went much deeper, and that you're not telling the truth. I have evidence that Pierce was using his influence over people, forcing them into situations where they had no choice but to comply." Eleanor's face grew pale, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "I don't know where you're going with this, Miss Marple, but I assure you, I've done nothing wrong. Any debts I may have owed Pierce are entirely my personal affair, and they have no bearing on anyone else." Miss Marple's voice softened, but there was a steely edge behind it. "I'm afraid, Miss Fairclough, that your personal affairs have far-reaching consequences. G. Pierce was not simply after money, was he? I believe he wanted something much more valuable: control." Eleanor's expression shifted for the first time, a flicker of fear crossing her face. She quickly covered it, but Miss Marple had already seen it. The truth was beginning to unravel, and Eleanor was struggling to keep it together. "Perhaps you can tell me more about the nature of your relationship with Mr. Henshaw," Miss Marple continued, her voice now quiet but firm. "You see, I believe his murder was not simply about a financial dispute. It was about leverage that Pierce had over both you and Henshaw." Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to sit here and listen to these accusations," she said, her voice rising with controlled fury. "You have no proof of any of this, Miss Marple. You have no right to come into my home and make such wild claims." Miss Marple remained seated, unfazed. "I'm afraid the evidence is mounting, Miss Fairclough, and soon the truth will come out, whether you're ready or not." Eleanor's gaze was icy now, but there was a sense of desperation lurking beneath the surface. She took a deep breath, then spoke in a much quieter voice. "You think you've figured everything out, don't you, Miss Marple? But you're wrong. You don't know the full extent of what's at stake." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let her surprise show. "What do you mean, Miss Fairclough?" For the first time, Eleanor hesitated, as though weighing her words carefully. "You don't know how far we've come, or what we're capable of." Miss Marple stood slowly, her gaze never leaving Eleanor's. "We'll see, Miss Fairclough, we'll see." Chapter 12. Miss Marple and Inspector Thorne left Fairclough Manor in silence, both lost in their thoughts. The conversation with Eleanor Fairclough had been more revealing than either of them had expected, but it hadn't been enough to break her. Miss Marple could feel it in the air, a strange mixture of fear and defiance that clung to the woman like a cloak. Eleanor was hiding something, but the game had shifted. Eleanor was now playing a different role, one that Miss Marple had yet to fully understand. "Do you think she knows we're getting close?" Thorne asked, his voice low as they stepped into the cold London evening. The streets were alive with activity, but the weight of the conversation hung heavy between them. "I believe she does," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet but determined. "And I think she's afraid. But there's something else, something deeper. G. Pierce is at the heart of all of this, and Eleanor knows more than she's letting on. But we still don't know exactly what that is." Thorne nodded thoughtfully. "I agree, and I think she's more involved than just the financial side of things. There's a tension in her, something personal. But what exactly that is, I don't know." They paused at the corner, the sounds of the busy city filling the space around them. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the flickering lights in the distance, and for a moment her mind wandered back to the clues they had uncovered so far. The mysterious G. Pierce, the debts, Eleanor's evasions, the murder, everything was connected. But how? "I think it's time we revisit the past, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice gaining a clarity that had been missing before. "There's a key to all of this, and I suspect it lies in the history of the Fairclough family. They've been wealthy for generations, but not in the way most people think. I think Eleanor's grandfather may have had dealings with G. Pierce's family. Deals that were never properly disclosed. We need to look into that." Thorne's eyes widened. "You think the family history plays a part in all of this?" "I do," Miss Marple replied, "but it's more than just the Faircloughs. G. Pierce is tied to something much darker, something that goes back a lot further than any of us realized. If we can uncover the truth about his family, we'll finally understand what happened to Mr. Henshaw. But we need to find those old records, the ones Eleanor's grandfather may have hidden." Thorne's frown deepened. "Do you have any idea where we might find these records?" Miss Marple nodded. "There's a small archive, hidden away in the Fairclough Estate's library. Only a few trusted members of the family would have access to it. But I believe Eleanor's grandmother had kept detailed accounts of all of the dealings, especially with outside investors. If we can get to those records, we'll have our answers." "I'll arrange for someone to keep an eye on Eleanor," Thorne said, his voice low but steady. "In the meantime, let's get to the library and see if we can find anything useful." They made their way to the archives of the Fairclough estate, the grand manor standing in quiet isolation. The library, once a symbol of opulence, now felt like a mausoleum, silent and suffocating. As Miss Marple stepped into the dimly lit room, she felt the weight of the past settle around her, its presence almost palpable. The shelves were lined with leather-bound books and dusty tomes, but Miss Marple's focus remained on one thing: the hidden records. She moved through the rows of books, her fingers brushing over the spines as she searched for a sign, a clue that would lead her to the truth. It didn't take long before she found what she was looking for. A small, unmarked door, tucked away behind a velvet curtain, caught her eye. She approached it carefully, her heart racing with anticipation. Thorne followed closely behind, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. They both knew what lay beyond this door would likely be the key to unlocking the entire mystery. The door creaked open, revealing a small study, more private than the main library, and far more ancient. The shelves in this room were cluttered with papers, folders, and old ledgers. Miss Marple's eyes darted over the cluttered space, her gaze landing on a large chest in the far corner of the room. "That's it," Miss Marple said, pointing to the chest. "The records we need will be inside." Thorne stepped forward, his hand resting on the chest's heavy lid. With a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted it. Inside, the chest was filled with old yellowing papers. As Miss Marple began to sift through them, her eyes brightened. She had found it, an entire ledger detailing investments, partnerships, and transactions. The names were familiar, but one name stood out above the others: G. Pierce. "Here it is," Miss Marple said, a triumphant note in her voice. "This is where it all began. These records show the true nature of G. Pierce's involvement in the Fairclough family. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a partner, a shadow in the background, controlling things from afar. And if these records are accurate, Pierce's dealings with Eleanor's grandfather were far from legitimate." Thorne leaned in to look at the ledger. This is it. It's all connected. And now we have the evidence." Miss Marple smiled, but her expression was one of quiet resolve. "We're not done yet, Inspector, but we've taken a huge step forward. Now we just have to follow the trail all the way to the end." Chapter 13. The days that followed were charged with a new sense of urgency. Miss Marple and Inspector Thorne had uncovered the heart of the mystery, but it wasn't enough to simply have the records. They needed to confront the truth, to expose it, and to ensure that the murder of Mr. Henshaw, along with the decades of manipulation and deceit, was brought to light. The ledger they had found at Fairclough Manor was an intricate map of financial dealings, but it was the last few pages that held the key. The deeper connections between the Fairclough family and G. Pierce became clear. Pierce wasn't merely a partner in some business venture. He had effectively been a silent owner of the Fairclough estate, pulling the strings behind Eleanor's family for years. His debts and manipulations had turned them into pawns in a far larger scheme. With this revelation, Miss Marple and Thorne had what they needed to finally understand the murder. But they still hadn't answered the most important question. Why had Mr. Henshaw died? Miss Marple turned over the details in her mind as she stood before the fireplace in her cottage, watching the flames flicker and crackle. The pieces had come together, but the puzzle wasn't complete until the final confrontation. "I think we have enough to go to the authorities now, Inspector," Miss Marple said as Thorne entered her room. "But I believe we must first make one final visit. There's one person left who knows everything." Thorne looked at her with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Who do you mean?" "Eleanor Fairclough," Miss Marple replied. "She's been hiding behind her family's name for far too long. She's the one who allowed Pierce's schemes to continue. And now she's the one who will have to face the consequences." The two of them set out once again for Fairclough Manor, where the final showdown would take place. As they arrived, the grand estate seemed almost too silent, as though the secrets within its walls were waiting to be uncovered. Eleanor was waiting for them in the drawing room, her posture regal, but her eyes betraying the weariness that Miss Marple had noticed in their previous encounter. She was more composed this time, but Miss Marple could see the cracks in her demeanour. She was on edge, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. "Miss Marple, Inspector Thorne," Eleanor greeted them coolly, standing as they entered. "I suppose you've come to accuse me of something else." "Not accuse, Miss Fairclough," Miss Marple said quietly, but with steel behind her words. "I've come to finish what we started. I have all the pieces now. The records, the debts, the manipulation. It's all here, Eleanor. But the most important question remains. Why?" Eleanor's lips tightened, but she didn't look away. She had known this moment was coming. She had known it ever since the first crack in her carefully constructed world had appeared. "You want to know why?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I had no choice. Pierce gave me no choice." Thorne's brows furrowed. "No choice? What do you mean?" Eleanor's eyes darted to the large portrait of her grandfather that hung on the wall. "My family has always been wealthy, but it's always been more fragile than anyone knew. My grandfather made deals that were never disclosed, deals that tied us to men like G. Pierce. He wasn't just a business partner. He was a shadow pulling the strings. And when my father passed, I was left with the weight of it all. I had to keep the family name intact no matter the cost." Miss Marple listened, her mind piecing together the story. "And you allowed G. Pierce to continue his manipulations. You allowed him to take over your family's wealth, because you thought it was the only way to keep everything together." Eleanor nodded, her gaze falling to the floor. "Yes, Pierce promised me protection, promised me that if I did everything he asked, I would keep the family legacy. But it was never enough. Every time I gave him something, he demanded more, until finally he had control over everything, even Mr. Henshaw. Miss Marple's voice softened. And Mr. Henshaw? He didn't know, did he? He didn't know how deeply tied you were to Pierce. He thought he was just dealing with a businessman. Eleanor's eyes welled up with tears. He didn't know, and I didn't want him to. But when he found out about the debt, when he realized how far I'd gone to protect the family, he threatened to expose everything. That's when I made a mistake. Thorne stepped forward, his voice firm. You murdered him! Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment the mask of composure faltered. I didn't mean to. It was an accident. I tried to stop him from going to the police, from ruining everything. But he wouldn't listen. He was going to destroy everything I'd worked so hard to keep intact. And then G. Pierce appeared. He promised that if I did what he asked, he would help me. He made me believe it would be the only way out. Miss Marple watched Eleanor carefully, her heart heavy with the tragedy that had unfolded. Eleanor Fairclough had been a woman driven by fear and desperation. She had allowed herself to be manipulated by G. Pierce, and had lost everything in the process, including her humanity. I understand, Eleanor, Miss Marple said softly. But there's no more running now. It's time to face the consequences. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Thorne had already signalled for the authorities to arrive. Your family's legacy, your wealth, it was built on deceit, Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. And now it's time for the truth to come out. G. Pierce is the mastermind, but you allowed it to happen. You have to answer for what you've done. Eleanor sat in silence, her face a mask of regret and fear. As the door opened and the authorities entered, Miss Marple gave a final, sombre look to Eleanor. It was over.